My relationship with House of the Dragon is a little bit complex. I really loved the first season despite some of the glaring flaws, but season 2 did really leave a sour taste in my mouth for a litany of reasons. In the build up to season 2, I was making news and speculation videos and was generally really excited for the new season. And over the course of season 2, I made a huge list of videos I wanted to make analysing and theory crafting for the show. But I was so disappointed with the second season of House of the Dragon, I lost all enthusiasm to make those videos. And now, even as we're starting to get into the season 3 news cycle, I find myself with little interest in covering it. Maybe this will change the more news we get, but it's a stark contrast from how I felt post season 1. We can sit here all day and debate what went wrong with season 2, and maybe that's a video I will make one day. But one thing I really wanted to discuss is how HBO, and specifically Ryan Condal, are doing themselves no favours through what they've been saying to the media during and post season 2. For example, Ryan Condal's now infamous "it was all just green propaganda" line has become the catchphrase of the fandom whenever the show makes a questionable creative choice. In a lot of ways, comments made directly by Ryan Condal only made the sentiment that seemingly a vast majority of fans feel towards House of the Dragon even stronger. George R. R. Martin's now infamous blog post regarding his dissatisfaction with some of the creative direction House of the Dragon Season 2 took has really created this divide between Condal and HBO and with George R. R. Martin himself. In a recent interview with Entertainment Weekly, Condal was surprisingly candid in regard to a lot of the behind-the-scenes issues that plagued House of the Dragon Season 2, from the writer's strike to having the episode count cut to 8. He did make some genuinely valid points about some of his more questionable creative choices and why they had to be made. And while I personally don't fully agree with Ryan Condal's logic with many of these choices, which are blatant misrepresentations of the book and frankly nonsensical, I can respect the fact he's been more open about these issues than David Benioff and D.B. Weiss ever were when it came to Game of Thrones. But this interview, while it did bring up some real issues in terms of the production of Season 2, was a desperate attempt to spin George R. R. Martin's blog posts and feelings regarding the changes made to his work as a bitter old man who doesn't have a clue how TV is made. I will simply say, I made every effort to include George in the adaptation process. I really did, over years and years, and we really enjoyed a mutually fruitful, I thought really strong collaboration for a long time. But at some point, as we got deeper down the road, he just became unwilling to acknowledge the practical issues at hand in a reasonable way. And I think, as a showrunner, I have to keep my practical producer hat on, and my creative writer, lover of the material hat on, at the same time. At the end of the day, I just have to keep marching not only the writing process forward, but also the practical parts of the process forward for the sake of the crew, the cast, and for HBO, because that's my job. So I can only hope that George and I can rediscover that harmony someday. But that's what I have to say about it. Ryan Condal to Entertainment Weekly. Now, in principle, what Condal states in regard to the process of making a TV show is not wrong. However, I strongly disagree with this narrative Condal is trying to construct around George R. R. Martin. This idea, man who has worked in TV for years prior to his mainstream success as both a writer and a showrunner, doesn't understand the harsh realities of TV production. That his resistance to changes that were clearly going to negatively impact the story as simply him not understanding the process and being difficult. George R. R. Martin, while rightly unhappy about the changes made to Game of Thrones, I think understood why they needed to be made, in a lot of cases. He may not have liked them, and I think he has rightly pointed out, specifically from how much was cut from A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, but even after the lackluster final season of the show, George never broke rank or spoke too negatively about the show or the showrunners in the press. I personally believe he never did because even he can acknowledge his part in where Game of Thrones went wrong. If he had managed to publish The Winds of Winter 13 years ago like he believed he would, the show would have gone down a very different path. George is very much aware of his role in the issues the show faced. That has not been the case with House of the Dragon. While Fire and Blood is a fictional history book, what it does contain is a complete guideline and narrative from start to finish for a writer to follow. For the most part, Condal did this during Season 1 with some minor changes to plot and characters, but I think it's extremely disingenuous to claim that some of the drastic changes made during Season 2 were simply not just creative choices made by the writers, hence George R. R. Martin's resistance to them. But Ryan's quote about changes and George being resistant, not understanding TV, is fundamentally wrong, for a very simple reason. Game of Thrones made several changes that George R. R. Martin not only approved of, but loved, and in some cases have influenced how he's written future work. What I want to do is take a look at some of these changes, because it really just shows us how this comment by Condal is not only inherently false, but blatant lie. One of the challenging parts of bringing the Dance of the Dragons to life is while Fire and Blood gives the reader a complete narrative and some fundamental idea of who a character is, adapting it to TV always meant fleshing out these characters on a much deeper level. I think for the most part in Season 1, House of the Dragon did a really good job with this, none more so than with Paddy Considine and his portrayal of Viserys Targaryen. The writers and Paddy brought the vague shell of a character we have on page to life in a deeply compelling way, with him arguably the highlight of the season and perhaps possibly the entire show. And it very much seems that George R. R. Martin agreed with this sentiment and had nothing but praise for the changes made to Viserys by both Paddy and the writers. In an interview with IGN from 2022, Paddy Considine says George R. R. Martin was so pleased how Viserys' live-action iteration turned out that he told the actor his portrayal was the superior character in the end. To quote Considine, "I got a text that simply said, 'Your Viserys is better than mine.' It was from George R. R. Martin, and I thought, that'll do it, thanks for trusting me." In a blog post later that year, George went further, stating that following the character he created with Ryan and Sarah and the rest of our writers for the show is a much more powerful and tragic and fully fleshed out than my own version in Fire and Blood, that I'm half tempted to go back and rip out those chapters and rewrite the whole history of his reign. Paddy deserves an Emmy for his episode alone. If he doesn't get one, hey, there's no justice. Meanwhile, I'm going to give Archmaester Gildane a smack for leaving out so much good stuff. So not only does this show that George R. R. Martin's understanding of need for change to bring the characters from Fire and Blood to life, but he believes the show version of the character is superior to his own. This doesn't really ring true to Ryan Condal's suggestion that George didn't understand the necessity of change needing to be made by the TV shows. And it's not just with Viserys. George has been open with praise for the changes made to the characters in the show. In particular, he's admitted the show's version of Helena Targaryen is much more involved and complex character than her book counterpart. He also has shared similar sentiments regarding how the show has portrayed Aemon Targaryen and the bullying he suffered as a child directly impacting the person he became. Even as far back as Season 1 of Game of Thrones, George was very happy to praise changes made to his story that elevated it, and in some cases, arguably improved it. Some scenes may work out well on page, but might not translate to screen directly, thus need to be changed to make it work for TV. One of these changes was in fact maybe the plot twist that locked in millions of viewers onto Game of Thrones, the execution of Ned Stark. In fact, the show's version of it has become so iconic, sometimes when I reread the book, it really hits me how fundamentally different and arguably better the show handles the moment. In the book, Fire Cannot Kill a Dragon by James Hibbard, a behind-the-scenes look at the production of Game of Thrones that came out in 2020, George is quoted as saying the following: "I have an ego. Normally I like things done the way I did it, but David and Dan improved that scene. In the books, Ned doesn't really say anything or see Arya there, and it's pure coincidence that Yoren finds her. It's a lovely moment, and I wish I'd done it that way. The death of Ned Stark could not have been done any better." So again, George is full of praise for such a huge change from his source material. He recognises, as written, it wouldn't have worked as well in the TV format, and thus why changes to the approach had to be made. This kind of runs with the theme of the first 4 seasons of the show, where many of the changes made, even some of the huge plot points, did make sense in the context of the TV show, which is why George very rarely spoke out against the changes during those early seasons. Of course, I believe his attitude to the show did sour after Benioff and Wise covered A Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons in a single season, cutting off huge parts of the plot and fundamentally changing parts of the story. While at this time George was dropping many hints in his blogs about the butterfly effect of doing that, he never really publicly spoke out against the show or Benioff and Wise, even post Season 8, the way he has done currently with House of the Dragon and Ryan Condal. If you dig deep enough, you will find there are more direct quotes about specific changes George R. R. Martin liked, made by Game of Thrones, and there are much more specific examples of those he did like than he didn't. However, the examples of the changes he didn't like do seem to have much more of a deeper impact on the story than the changes he did like. Two that often get brought up very often as changes he did like relate to minor but important changes in how a character was portrayed. In 2011, in an interview with Collider, George stated that Natalia Tenner's portrayal of Orsha really made him rethink her as a character and her role in the story. He's quoted as saying, "The only actress who really made me rethink a character is Natalia Tenner's Orsha. She's younger, more attractive and more dynamic than I initially written the character. And when Orsha comes back into the story, and I hope that she will, I'm definitely going to take that into account." So here we have an example of a change the show made directly influencing how George perhaps wants to write future material. In 2015, George posted a blog. George was very open about the fact that Sybil Kikili's portrayal of Shay in the show made him regret killing her off, while also directly praising Benioff and Wise for making the character more interesting. George stated the following: "Sybil is bright and beautiful, and a joy to work with, and she made a great Shay. I said more than once that it was probably a good thing that the character was already dead before I met Sybil, or I might never have had the heart to kill her. Show Shay, thanks to David and Dan and Sybil, was actually a much different and more interesting character than Book Shay, I blush to admit." Building on this, if you've never sat down and listened to the DVD commentary tracks for Game of Thrones, even the ones without George R. R. Martin, you will learn a lot about why some of these decisions were made by Benioff and Wise. What I find most interesting is many of the added scenes in Season 1 were done so because the episode runtimes were running so short they needed to add in new content. For example, the scene where Jaime, Robert and Barristan share war stories was one of those scenes, as well as the heart-to-heart talk between Robert and Cersei. These new scenes, I think, were, for the most part, well written and added a lot to the story. It seems George R. R. Martin agrees with this, stating in a commentary he especially liked the scene between Robert and Cersei. In Season 2, George had written the Battle of the Blackwater episode. In it, he had added the scene towards the end of the battle where Cersei and Tommen are sat on the throne, with Cersei about to poison Tommen, thinking the battle was lost. In the commentary for the episode, George says that he did write a version of that scene, but Benioff and Wise completely changed it and its dialogue, and he said that it was a great decision because that scene ended up being really good and better than what he had originally written. What all this shows is that George R. R. Martin clearly understands why things need to change when bringing his world to screen, and in a lot of cases, he backed these changes that elevated the source material rather than took away from it, where many of these changes he agreed with, making sense within the context of the story being told. And that's what seems to be the difference with House of the Dragon, that George has taken issue with. The changes being made in his view do not do that, and if anything, hinders the story, making key story beats and characters no longer really make sense. Even when changes were made to Game of Thrones that upset George, and fundamentally he disagreed with, he always seemed to be diplomatic about the need for it to happen, and played devil's advocate about why it might have been the right thing to do for the show, even if he personally disagreed. So even when he publicly disagreed with Benioff and Wise, which it turns out was quite rare, he did so without taking shots at the show itself. Back in 2017, during an interview with Esquire, George talked very openly about how he, Benioff and Wise disagreed with cutting Lady Stoneheart from the show. He said the following: "At some points, when Dave and Dan and I had discussions about what way we should go in, I always favoured sticking with the books, where they would favour making changes. I think one of the biggest ones would probably be when they made a decision not to bring Catelyn Stark back as Lady Stoneheart. That was probably the first major diversion of the show from the books, and, you know, I argued against that, and Dan and Dave made that decision. In my version of the story, Catelyn Stark is re-imbued with a kind of life force, and becomes this vengeful wight, who galvanizes a group of people around her, and is trying to exact her revenge on the Riverlands. Dan and Dave made a decision not to go in that direction in their story, pursuing other threads, but both of them are equally valid. I think because Catelyn Stark is a fictional character and she doesn't exist, you can tell either story about her. So, while he disagrees with cutting Stoneheart, he still is diplomatic and calls Benioff and Wise's take on the story valid. Even when it comes to the practicalities of production, something that Ryan Condal criticised George for, he still seems to get it. I recall an interview around Season 3, where he openly talks about his disappointment regarding the extent of Tyrion's injuries after the Battle of the Blackwater. In the book, he loses most of his nose and has a horrendous scar, and he'd hoped that the show would also do this. But he later went on to admit that the practical reality of having to CGI Peter Dinklage's face for the rest of the show would not only be time consuming, but eat up huge chunks of the budget. So clearly, George does understand the idea of sometimes sacrifices need to be made for the greater good of the show. In a way, I do kind of feel a little bit sorry for Ryan Condal. There are a lot of things that went wrong with season 2, but his hand was kind of forced to make these changes and cuts by powers beyond his control. Despite what's been stated in interviews, while the Writers Guild strike didn't really impact the writing of season 2 that much, given the key role the writers still play while a show is in production, it surely did have some kind of impact. And while Condal has tried to put a positive spin on HBO cutting the episode count down to 8, you can clearly see in the structure of season 2 the negative impact it had on the season, and it certainly is going to have a knock-on effect into season 3. But, and it is a huge but, while Condal was dealt a rough set of cards, many of the issues season 2 faced did come as a direct result of creative decisions he and the writers' room made that absolutely have nothing to do with the writers' strike or a reduced episode count. These creative choices they made freely, and they did have a negative impact not only on the structure and the pacing of the story, but in a lot of ways betrays the characters the show itself has established, let alone their book counterparts. While I can understand where Condal was coming from in this interview, I felt that his comments regarding George R. R. Martin's reluctance and inability to allow things to change, implying he doesn't understand how TV works, is frankly wrong and disingenuous at best. George has decades of experience writing, producing, and showrunning television. He's very aware how the game works, and how difficult adapting a book can be, which is why he was always so hesitant to sell the screen rights to A Song of Ice and Fire in the first place. But not only that, he's proven during the run of Game of Thrones that he's open to change, embraces change, and even when he personally disagrees with the direction the show took, tries to play devil's advocate. It must have been really hard for Ryan Condal to deal with George's blog post. It was totally unprecedented and did not paint him or his team in a very good light. Of course, most fans are going to side with George R. R. Martin, the creator of the world in most cases. It makes sense why he would defend himself and his choices. If he really has looked up to George his whole life, then of course his negative response to your work and souring of your relationship is going to hurt. While I don't agree with most of what Condal says in this interview, I understand his position, but just feel trying to paint George as a blockage for your vision of his own work is a funny way to try and justify why some elements of the show went wrong. The very actions and words of George R. R. Martin himself disproves Condal's assessment of the situation.